I, I'm going to say part of what I'm going to say. I've said before, but I will continue. One second, let me just shut off my phone. Yeah, but I want to apply it to things that are taking place now in Israel, in the United States, a reaction to what's happening in Israel. And in the process, I will have additional thoughts on the Sedra. But the first pasuk in Mishpatim, Ve'ela Mishpatim Asher Tasim Lifneihem. These are the judgments. It's interesting that it uses the lashon judgments instead of laws, but that you shall place before them. And Rashi, the first Rashi says that the Vav is to connect it with what was mentioned previously. But Rashi questions, and really it comes from the Mechilta. What is the connection? The end of last week's Sedra, the end of Parshas Yisro, talks about the halachos of a mizbeach, how a mizbeach is supposed to be built, what it is to be built from. But so, what is the connection to Eila HaMishpatim Asher Tasim Lifneihem? And then it goes into Eved Ivri of the laws of a Jewish servant. Probably servant is a better word than slave, especially when you talk about an Eved Ivri person who was compelled to sell himself as a servant because he didn't have money, he owed money, or because he or compelled because he stole, whatever it is. The Mocher Atzmo, he sold himself into slavery, or Machru Bezdin, or Bezdin sold him into slavery because of the crimes that he might have committed. So, V'loma nismacha parshas dinim lepashim zbeach lomar lecha shetasim Sanhedrin eitzel hamikdash. In order to tell you that you should put the Sanhedrin, the Bezdin Hagadol, has to be by the Beis Hamikdash. And there are certain texts that say Eitzel HaMizbeach. After all, the previous Parsha talks about the Mizbeach, about the altar. Now, there's no real contradiction, certainly according to the Rambam, between the two texts, because the Rambam says that the Ramban, some say, disagrees with this point. We'll get into the opinion of the Ramban soon also. And I don't know that necessarily we have to say there's a machlokus. It could be actually the two shitas fit together. But the Rambam says that the purpose of the mitzvah of binyan Beis HaMikdash, of building a Beis HaMikdash and having a Beis HaMikdash, is in order to have a place to do the avoda, and that the Jewish people should come in the time of the regalim. So, in other words, the main function of the Beis Hamikdash, according to the Ramban seems to have a different opinion on that. But the main function of the Beis Hamikdash, according to the Rambam, was to have a place for the avoda, to do the karbonos, to do the sacrifices. So Eitzel HaMizbeach, since that's the main function, so Eitzel HaMizbeach means in the Beis Hamikdash. So there are some that have difficulty with the word Eitzel HaMizbeach next to the altar, because not every Kohanim, only Kohanim were able to come into that area. So but we could say Eitzel HaMizbeach, Eitzel HaMikdash, Eitzel HaMizbeach means where it's in the Beis Hamikdash. Of course, it had to be in the Lishkas HaGazis, But the whole Beis Hamikdash was called Eitzel HaMizbeach because, according to the Rambam, the purpose of the Beis Hamikdash was to have a place for the avoda, and the central function of the avoda, the avoda, the main place for the avoda was by the mizbeach, by the altar. So it really means the same thing. But so why is it? To tell you, Shetasim Sanhedrin Eitzel Hamikdash. In order that tell you that the Sanhedrin should be next to be in the Beis Hamikdash or next to the altar. Now we have to understand, of course, it's difficult to ask questions of why. But we can ask what? What is the lesson that is to be derived from the fact that the altar, that the Sanhedrin should be in the Beis Hamikdash? What's the purpose of it? And I think that we could understand it on the basis of a certain Ramban. The Ramban, in discussing the purpose of the Mishkan, he says first of all, that the Mishkan was to have a place for the Aram, for the ark that had the Aseres Hadibros in it. But more than that, the Ramban says that the purpose of the Ramban asks a question. The Ramban asks a question as to why the second half of Chumash Shemos discusses the building of the Mishkan. After all, the topic or the theme of Chumash Shemos is the theme of Chumash Shemos is the Yetzias Mitzrayim, the Exodus from Egypt, with Matan Torah, with the giving of the Torah. And the Ramban says that the reason the mitzvah of building the Mishkan is mentioned in the second half and the of Chumash Shemos is to emphasize that the purpose of the Mishkan was to serve as a vehicle to transfer the Kedusha of Har Sinai, to transfer the sanctity of Mount Sinai to Yerushalayim. In other words, it was a linkage. It linked Maimed Har Sinai. It linked the giving of the Torah with the building of the Beis Hamikdash in Yerushalayim. And we can understand what it said. What the idea behind it is that the Torah wanted Matan Torah to be perpetuated. Matan Torah is not just a historical event, but Matan Torah is something that continues from generation to generation, from parent to student, from parent to child, from teacher to student. And it's symbolized by the Mishkan, by the transferring of the Kedusha of Har Sinai to Yerushalayim. Now, we have to understand what's the idea behind it. After all, the Torah is being transferred. The Torah was taken in an Aron. What's the idea of the Kedusha of Har Sinai being transferred? Now, I've mentioned many times that in the Haggadah of Pesach, we say, Ilu Kirvanu Lifnei Har Sinai. V'lo nasan lanu es Torah dayenu. If HaKadosh Baruch Hu had given us the Torah, had taken us to Mount Sinai, and didn't give us the Torah, that in itself would have been a great thing. What would have been so great about coming to Har Sinai and not receiving the Torah? I mean, Har Sinai, first of all, it's a mountain. And while the Klal Yisrael was there waiting to receive the Torah, it had Dusha. It was endowed with holiness. No one was allowed to go on the mountain. But why is it? But what's the significance? But I mentioned the Ilu Kirvanu Lifnei Har Sinai, V'lo nasan lanu es HaTorah. In other words, in Mount Sinai, what is the douche of Har Sinai? What is the sanctity of Har Sinai? The Rambam mentions there is a dispute whether the Makom HaMikdash, the place of the Mikdash, is Kitchel L'Shaita v'Kitchel L'Asad Lavo, or it's not Kitchel L'Asad Lavo. The sanctity that was endowed by Shlomo HaMelech in the Beis HaMikdash, whether it was a permanent dusha or it's a temporary dusha. When I say temporary, I mean that at the time of Korban Bayis Rishon, that dusha, the sanctity that Shlomo HaMelech endowed in the Beis HaMikdash, there is a dispute, not a dispute, there's a question, I should say. Seems to be a contradiction between the Rambam and the Gemara in Zvachim. The Rambam says that the Kedusha of Har Sinai was endowed by Shlomo HaMelech. The Gemara in Zvachim says, Ki Kiddush David, that actually the Kedusha of the Makom of the place was done by David HaMelech. From the Psukim, it's mashma like the Rambam. All right, so there's a piece of Torah from my uncle explaining it, how to resolve the contradiction. But in any case, the question is whether the Dushas HaMikdash, the sanctity of the Mikdash, that was endowed by Shlomo HaMelech in the Beis HaMikdash, did it come to an end when the Jewish people went to Golas Bavel, when they went into Babylonian exile, and then when Ezra returned and rebuilt the second Beis HaMikdash, he endowed it again with Dusha? Or no, the original Dusha, the original sanctity that Shlomo HaMelech endowed the Makom HaMikdash with, that he endowed the Beis HaMikdash, that he endowed the temple with, remains in effect forever. And the Rambam paskins that dusha is a permanent dusha. And the Rambam even gives a reason for it. The Rambam says, because the dusha of the Beis HaMikdash is dusha shchina. It is the sanctity of the presence of God. And the sanctity of the presence of God is a permanent dusha. And in a sense, how did God, what happened at Har Sinai? And Har Sinai, God, Vayered Hashem, the Torah tells us, HaKadosh Baruch Hu went down to Har Sinai, and his Targum Onkelos explains that God revealed himself to Har Sinai. After all, certainly from the perspective of the certainly from the perspective of Balatanya, and probably even according to Reb Chaim Volozhiner in a different sort of way, HaKadosh Baruch Hu's presence is always all over the world. The Izgala means that there was revelation. Man was able to sense the presence of God in a most maximum way. This is one of the big questions in Kabbalah. One of the big questions in Kabbalah is, if HaKadosh Baruch Hu is in the world, the Gra has an altogether different sheet on this. But if HaKadosh Baruch Hu is there in the world, so how do we make a difference between the Makom HaMikdash, between a shul, a beis medrash, a house, and even rooms in the house that can't be involved in dusha, a washroom, a beis hamerchatz? If HaKadosh Baruch Hu's there, he's everywhere. And all kinds of terutzim are given. All kinds of explanations are given. But to put it in simple language, I would suggest that there is no difference in the nature of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's presence anywhere in the world. The difference is in our ability of perceiving God. And when we say God revealed himself, in other words, to us it appeared as if God revealed himself. Because up to the time of Matan Torah, of course, HaKadosh Baruch Hu's presence was everywhere, but we weren't as sensitive to his presence. But at the time of Matan Torah, we became sensitive, more sensitive to the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. HaKadosh Baruch Hu endowed us with a special ability to sense his presence. And in the Beis Hamikdash, when there was Gilui Shechina, HaKadosh Baruch Hu was there before, but in the Beis Hamikdash, we're more sensitive to the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu than we are in other places. Just as we were more sensitive at Matan Torah, at Har Sinai. And of course, a shul, a beis medrash has less sensitivity. We have less sensitivity to the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu than in the Beis HaMikdash, but more so than other places. And the same thing is true. The same thing is true it's us who are affected, but to us who weren't as sensitive prior to being in the Beis Hamikdash, prior to Matan Torah, to us it appears that HaKadosh Baruch Hu revealed himself in a greater fashion. But in truth, what HaKadosh Baruch Hu, this is what I think, in truth, it is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu made us more sensitive to his presence. And so the Beis Hamikdash, now, Ilu Kirvanu Lifnei Har Sinai doesn't mean God brought us close to Mount Sinai and gave us it brought us close to Mount Sinai. But Ilu Kirvanu Lifnei Har Sinai means if God brought us close to himself. Kirav, God brought us close to himself at Mount Sinai. Igalu Kirvanu Lifnei Har Sinai. If God brought us close to himself at Mount Sinai, V'lo nasan lanu es Torah, and he didn't give us the Torah. He revealed himself to us. We would have sensed his presence. That would have been a great accomplishment in itself. But at Mount Sinai, you saw what my father would have called. My father would say that at Mount Sinai, you had the fire of Sinai and the Torah of Sinai. And my uncle would say you had the Kolos Ubrakim of Sinai, but they talk about the experience of Sinai. What does that mean? The fire of Sinai, the Kolos Ubrakim of Sinai. I think what it means is it's forms of sensing the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. At Har Sinai, the Jewish people sense the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We have to sense the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu wherever we go. But in the Beis Hamikdash and in Har Sinai at the time of Matan Torah, we had a greater ability to sense his presence. And that is the experience of Sinai. We have to couple the Torah of Sinai with the experience of Sinai, with the fire of Sinai. And I think that in a certain sense, that was the idea of the Beis Hamikdash. Yes, the Beis Hamikdash was, on one hand, it represents Har Sinai because in the Beis Hamikdash was the Luchos. And you should know, even though in Bayis Sheni, there was no Luchos there, there's certainly in the Kodesh Kodashim, there was a makom for the Yaron. But more than that, according to the way the Rambam paskins, I know there's a machlokus in the Gemara, but the way the Rambam paskins, the Luchos were hidden at the end of Bayis Rishon. When the Beis Hamikdash was built by Shlomo HaMelech, he built a lower chamber directly under the Kodesh Kodashim, where to have another place to put the Aron, when the Aron will have to be hidden. And I saw, my uncle said, and also I saw it in the Chedushay Torah of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, that it wasn't just a separate place to store. Why does the Rambam go and tell us that Shlomo HaMelech, when he built the Beis Hamikdash, he made a lower chamber that when the Luchos and the Yaron have to be hidden together with a number of other things, had to be hidden. It was made it was put in this lower chamber. Why does the Rambam have to go to tell us that Shlomo HaMelech did it? The Rambam's not a history book, it's a halacha sefer. Who cares who did it? So my uncle said, Lubavitcher Rebbe also said, that actually that lower chamber was part of the Beis Hamikdash, more than being part of the Beis Hamikdash. When the Beis Hamikdash was built, it was built with two places for the Aron. So even during Bayis Sheni, when there was no Aron visible, but there was an Aron with the Luchos in the lower chamber. And we have to say that according to the opinion of the Ramban says, I mean, there are other teretzim we could give. I shouldn't say we have to say it, but I think it's true in any case. The Ramban says that the purpose of the Beis Hamikdash was to have a place, he says, for the Mishkan. So if we assume that what the Ramban says about the Mishkan is true about the Beis Hamikdash, to have a place for the Aron with the Luchos, so we could suggest, so the question many ask, what about during Bayis Sheni? Why did they build Bayis Sheni? They didn't have an Aron. They didn't have the Luchos. The answer is they did have an Aron. They did have a Luchos. It was in the lower chamber. There were two places for the Aron. So in other words, the idea of the Beis Hamikdash, was to have a place for the Torah, to have the Luchos, which were given at Har Sinai. It was a perpetuation of Sinai. And the Luchos, and of course, in the Beis Hamikdash, they had the Sefer Torah written by Moshe Rabbeinu, the Sefer Torah written by Ezra HaSofer. That represented the perpetuation of the Torah that was given in the Midbar. And there was the Makom of the Sanhedrin. What was the reason? What was the purpose of having a special place for the Sanhedrin? We're told that Moshe Kishim V'chad Koi. Moshe Rabbeinu was like the best in Haggadah. But we could raise a Hakira, if I could use that word. Are we to understand that to mean that Moshe Rabbeinu acted as the best in Haggadah? And if we say that Moshe Rabbeinu acted as a Bezdin Haggadah, so we could suggest that when Moshe Rabbeinu acted as a Bezdin Haggadah, in the notes of the Brisker Rav, he mentions in the name of my grandfather that even though Moshe Rabbeinu had a din of Bezdin Haggadah, but it could be he needed two other people with him in order to have that din of a Bezdin Haggadah. You know, Moshe Rabbeinu was able to turn a Bezdin into a Bezdin Haggadah. Was able to turn a Bezdin into a Bezdin Haggadah. But or you could say that Moshe Rabbeinu himself was like a Bezdin Haggadah. But in any case, Moshe Rabbeinu had a din of Bezdin Haggadah. Or perhaps we could say the reverse, that Bezdin Haggadah replaces Moshe Rabbeinu. To a certain degree, takes the place of Moshe Rabbeinu. And if we suggest that Bezdin Haggadah takes the place of Moshe Rabbeinu, we could say that that's part of this whole same idea. In other words, the idea was that the Beis Hamikdash is the perpetuation of Matan Torah. It is the continuation of Matan Torah. And being the continuation of Matan Torah and the perpetuation of Matan Torah, so the Bezdin Haggadah, the Bezdin Haggadah was acting in place of Moshe Rabbeinu, because at Matan Torah, who was the messenger of God that gave the Torah to Klal Yisrael? It was Moshe Rabbeinu. And Bezdin Haggadah acts in place of Moshe Rabbeinu. It's interesting. In Parshas Yisro, last week Sedra, Vayihi Mimachras, it was the day after Yom Kippur, the day after Chazal tell us, the day after Moshe Rabbeinu came down with the Luchos Shnios, with the second Luchos, and he sat with the Jewish people who came to be Dorei Shalakim, to search out God. As he explained to Yisro. And he sat with them, Boker al Erev. He sat with them from morning to evening. And Yisro tells him, this can't continue. You're going to fall apart. The nation is going to fall apart. And Yisro suggests to him, and that is approved by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that he appoints judges underneath him, who and Kol Hadavar Kosher Yavian Elai, and anything that is extremely difficult, that the lower Batidinim, the lower officers, are not able to do themselves, are not able to paskin themselves, will be referred eventually to Moshe Rabbeinu. And of course, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we know, yes, sir, Hosef, he caused an extra parsha to be added. That's why Yisro, one of Yisro's names was Yeser. But the question is, why didn't Moshe Rabbeinu understand what Yisro understood? Now, why it had to be told through Yisro, why specifically Yisro? It could be that when it comes to ruling one Jew over another Jew, and when you have Sarei Alafim, Sarei Meos, all that, officers, you have to a certain degree Jews ruling over another. That's not a natural, at least in those days, it's not a natural Jewish trait. But just like by Malchus, I think the Shem Mishmuel points that out in regard to Malchus. Kingship had to come, or the ultimate kingship had to come from Moab, because ruling one Jew over another Jew is not a natural Jewish trait, certainly for generations. So perhaps one could disagree that it had to be identified with Yisro, because ruling one Jew over another Jew is not, we shouldn't see it as something that we naturally want to do. It's something that has to be done. We teach, and sometimes we have to use what they call the rule of law. But halacha Torah has to be given over primarily in a teaching perspective. And yes, it becomes necessary, but it's a trait that is more natural. Ruling one Jew over another Jew is not a natural Jewish trait. It's necessary, so it's revealed by someone who joins the Jewish people from outside the Jewish nation. But in any case, the question is, Moshe Rabbeinu, why didn't he understand it? It's true, Moshe Rabbeinu was born Jewish, but Moshe Rabbeinu, for so many years, was in Midian, and there are all kinds of midrashim that talk about how Moshe Rabbeinu himself was a melech in some other country. And Moshe Rabbeinu was brought up in the palace of Paro after Yocheved returned Moshe to Basya. And matter of fact, there are those who say, I think it might be the Ibn Ezra, I don't remember, that part of the reason the Hashgacha manipulated that Moshe Rabbeinu should be in the house of Paro was to learn, to observe how nations are run. Of course, it was to be run in a different way altogether, but there were things that had to be learned. Again, it was not something that was naturally Jewish. It had to be learned from the outside. After all, the Jewish people were a nation of avodim up to that point. We're a nation of slaves, of servants up to that point. But so why is it that Moshe Rabbeinu himself didn't understand what Yisro understood. It's true, Yisro was, according to the Medrash, Kohen Midyan. There's a machlokas where the Kohen Midyan means he was the priest of Midyan. There's a Medrash that says he was Oved, Kol Avodah Zarah Shabbalam. It's very difficult to understand how he could have been Oved Kol Avodah Zarah Shabbalam, unless we suggest that Yisro was involved in interfaith activity. Because I mean, all the Avodah Zarah in the world is I mean, there was so much Avodah Zarah in the world at the time. Okay, maybe it's not literally every single Avodah Zarah, but in any case, why didn't Moshe Rabbeinu understand it himself? Adon HaNeviim, he knew more than anybody else. Why didn't he understand it himself? And sometimes we don't understand something because we have an inclination, a desire, and not a desire, a vain desire, chas v'shalom, but it could be a holy desire. Moshe Rabbeinu understood. Vayihi b'machras, it was the day after the Luchos came down. Matan Torah had to be perpetuated. Matan Torah did not come to an end with the bringing down even of the second Luchos. And because of that, Moshe Rabbeinu felt that everybody that has a question has to come to him. He sat next to Har Sinai, where he brought down the Luchos, and that mission was not completed. And he wanted the Jewish people to come to him, for them to understand that when they're learning Torah, to the degree possible, Torah has to be learned as part of the continuation and the perpetuation of Matan Torah. And this was the idea of the Mishkan, of the Beis Hamikdash, the perpetuation of Matan Torah in a most maximum way. But it was a perpetuation of Matan Torah not only in the teaching of Torah, in the giving over of the Torah of Sinai, but the giving over of the experience of Sinai also. And to a certain degree, we could say, and I've suggested it in the past, that why is it that the Jewish people built an Egel Hazav? Because the perpetuation of the Torah of Sinai, in order for it to be successful, has to be accompanied to a certain degree with the experience of Sinai also. And Moshe Rabbeinu felt that experience will be perpetuated in a most maximum way if they come directly to him, the one who was the Shaliach HaKadosh Baruch Hu, who was the agent of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in bringing the Torah down to Klal Yisrael. And this was the purpose of the Beis HaMikdash also. The Bezdin Hagadol, when we say Moshe Keshivim B'chad Kai, Moshe Rabbeinu is in place of the Bezdin Hagadol. It's not so much that Moshe was in place of the Bezdin Hagadol, as the Bezdin Hagadol was in place of Moshe Rabbeinu. And certainly after the Matan Torah, Moshe Rabbeinu, so So the Bezdin Hagadol that is appointed later acts in place of Moshe Rabbeinu. And we could suggest that that's the pshat here. That's the reason why the Sanhedrin had to sit in the Beis Hamikdash, because the Beis Hamikdash is in place of Har Sinai, as the Ramban said. That's why we talk about the Mishkan and the Chumash Mos, because it represents the continuation of Sinai, the taking of the Dusha. What does the taking of the Dusha mean? Taking that experience of the ability to sense the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in a most maximum way. And taking that to the Yerushalayim, where according to the Rambam Shita, it's Kitcha L'Shaita V'Kitcha L'Asad Lavo. And the Sanhedrin, that's in place of Moshe Rabbeinu, the Bezdin Hagadol. And it's very interesting that the Rambam in Hilchos Mamrim tells us that when Bezdin Hagadol rules on a certain shaila, on a certain question, so we have to see it as if the psak of the Bezdin Hagadol was given to Moshe Rabbeinu at Har Sinai. That's what the Rambam in Hilchos Mamrim says. And in order for us to be able to sense that attitude, or to have that attitude, Bezdin Hagadol, that was in place of Moshe Rabbeinu, sat in the Beis Hamikdash, that was in place of Har Sinai. So that's why, and we could say actually that there's a double element in it. We don't have to say, but we could suggest that it's necessary for the Bezdin Hagadol. We find, it's interesting, my uncle, when he discusses about Kiddush HaChodesh, the Rambam says that a Bezdin that is Mekadesh the Chodesh has to have authorization to Mekadesh the Chodesh, to be able to sanctify the new month on the basis of the sighting of the moon. It has to be authorized by Bezdin Hagadol to do so. It doesn't mean every month they have to be authorized, but they have to get an authorization that this Bezdin has the ability to declare the new month. And the Ramban in Sefer HaMitzvahs, he jumps on the Rambam. He says, Bezdin Hagadol moved out of the Lishkas HaGazis, left the Lishkas HaGazis, their chamber in the Beis HaMikdash, 40 years before the Churban. So the question is, well, it's a double question. One question is, even during those 40 years, and then after the Churban, okay, they were in Yavne, they were in many different places, but how were they Mekadesh the Chodesh? There was no the Bezdin Hagadol lost its authority 40 years before the Churban, when the Bezdin Hagadol leaves the Lishkas HaGazis. They lose their authority as a Bezdin Hagadol, as the Bezdin Hagadol. They certainly retain certain authority. This is the question the Ramban asks. So my uncle mentioned that Bezdin Hagadol halachically acts in two capacities. On one hand, the Bezdin Hagadol is the Yom Torah Shebal Peh. They are the teachers of Torah Shabbal Peh, the oral tradition. And that's part of Maimon Har Sinai also. It wasn't just the Torah Shebechsav that was given at Har Sinai. The Torah Shabbal Peh was also given at Har Sinai. So Beis Din Hagadol, acting in place of Moshe Rabbeinu, they are the Amud Torah Shabbal Peh. But they also represent Klal Yisrael. Let's say Kibush Rabbi. There are certain halachas when you capture lands of Eretz Yisrael, in order to sanctify those lands with the dusha, with the sanctity of being of dushas Eretz Yisrael, the sanctity of the land of Israel. The invasion that you make to conquer those lands has to be with the authorization of Beis Din Hagadol. There's a stira between the Rambam and Hilchos Trumos and the Rambam and Hilchos Malachim, whether it's Beis Din Hagadol or it has to be Al Pidas Rov Yisrael, with most of the Jews agreeing. And my uncle said that Beis Din Hagadol acts on behalf of the Jewish people. So Beis Din Hagadol serves in a double capacity. And as far as that, acting on behalf of Klal Yisrael, they don't have to be in the Lishkas HaKosos. They don't have to be in the Beis HaMikdash. They could be in Yavne. They could be anywhere else. And HaKodesh Hazeh Lachem Rosh Chodoshim, the month was given over to the Jewish people as a nation. And when the Rambam says that he authorizes, that Beis Din Hagadol has to authorize the Batei Dinim to Mikadesh the Kodesh, to sanctify the new moon, to proclaim the calendar. So that's not acting in the capacity as the Amud Torah Shabbal Peh, as the pillar of the oral tradition, as the final decisors of Jewish law, in their special capacity as Beis Din Hagadol. But in the act that they are acting as the representatives, they're acting on behalf of the Jewish people. And in that capacity, under certain situations, the Jewish people as a nation have the ability, in a sense, to reject what the Beis Din Hagadol did in its name. However, when it comes to psak, being a decisor in Jewish law, the ultimate authority is Beis Din Hagadol, is the high Beis Din. And the question is, why should there be a difference? But the answer is, when Beis Din Hagadol acts as the decisors, as the ultimate decisors of Jewish law, they are acting, they are perpetuating the Torah as it was given in Sinai. They're acting in the place of Moshe Rabbeinu at Sinai. And in a maximum way, they can only be considered to be in place of Moshe Rabbeinu at Har Sinai when they're in the Beis HaMikdash, in the temple, which is in place of Mount Sinai. So this is the reason. Eila Mishpatim asher tasim lifneihem. So there has to be Eitzel HaMizbeach. It has to be in the Beis HaMikdash. And why does the Torah use it? Tell it to us about the Mizbeach. Because the Mizbeach is the place you give the Karban. And Karban, the Rishonim say, comes from the word Karev, coming close to God. The experience of Har Sinai, the douche of Har Sinai, manifests itself in sensing the closeness that we have to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, feeling of that sense of closeness to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Therefore, it has to be in the Beis HaMikdash. the Beis Din Hagadol, which is in place of Moshe Rabbeinu, has to be in the Beis Hamikdash. And I want to mention one other thing. The first thing the Torah tells us is about Eved Ivri. Why Eved Ivri? Of all the laws, why about Eved Ivri? There are many reasons. And Sheishanim Tabots, 6 years, he'll work. The 7th year, he goes free. It's almost, and then it's almost similar to Shabbos. 6 days you'll work. These Sheishanim Yavod V'Shvi Yeitzei Lachopshi Pinam. The 7th day we rest. We stop work. And so what's the significance? Why Eved Ivri is the first thing? And the analogy to Shabbos has to be understood. Now, in the first Luchos we read this past week, we're given the mitzvah of Shabbos. The mitzvah of Shabbos commemorates the 6 days of creation. And the 7th day, HaKadosh Baruch Hu rested, whatever that means. Another time we'll discuss it. I'm sure we have discussed it in the past. But the question is, how are we to understand all of this? And I think, what's the idea? And then in Parshas Veschanan, there Shabbos doesn't mention Bria Olam. There it mentions because HaKadosh Baruch Hu took us out of the land of Egypt. Question is, how does Shabbos commemorate the Jewish people going out of the land of Egypt? Of feeling free. What's the idea of Shabbos? Now, there are a number of answers we give. I want to talk only about one answer. Not that one answer contradicts another answer. There are many answers that we could give, have a number of approaches, but one is not in conflict with the other. I think, first of all, the difference the difference between Parshas Yisro and Parshas Veschanan, the idea is that, in a sense, that we are partners of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Asher bara l'kim lasos, and the Jewish people, more than any other people, are partners of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I don't know whether we could say that the Ummos Olam are partners of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Chasidei Ummos Olam, they have a Chelek L'Olam Haba, they're very great. But I don't know, could be from the time of Matan Torah, from the time of the Avos. The Jewish people accepted this idea of being partners of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Possibly it was only the Jewish people that are partners of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's not to not recognize the greatness of every human being or the potential greatness of every human being. But I would suggest that perhaps that when it comes to being an actual partner, that's something the Jewish people, and you see the halacha is that a non-Jew is not even allowed to observe Shabbos. There are limitations in that halacha. But from a certain perspective, it is the Jewish people that are partners of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And indicative of that is that 6 days we work, and the 7th day, we're free. A 7th day is Shabbos, just like HaKadosh Baruch Hu did that. And I want to suggest that there's a very interesting Igeris Harambam, some claim, because they don't like some of the other things that are mentioned in the Igeris Harambam. So whenever you don't like something that's brought down in the Rambam's name, you say, it was forged. This is one of those letters that there are those that claim was forged. Okay, in any case, I think it's a letter to Rabbeinu Avram, the son. So the Rambam says, Paro hu hayetzer hara. Paro is the Yetzer hara. Paro is the evil inclination in man. In other words, if you want to see your Yetzer hara, you want to see your potential for bad, when you look in the mirror, you'll see Paro. Look at Paro. Paro, Paro was ready to sacrifice his whole country, not to give in. That's the Yetzer hara. That's the power of the Yetzer hara. Vayachazek Hashem is like Paro, the spoon in the Ramban. The way my father explained it means that God gave Paro to do what he wanted. He gave him chizuk. He really didn't want to let the Jewish people out. He was feeling forced. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave him chizuk to do what he wanted to do, to demonstrate who Paro really is. Because we can be Paro also. And when we become Paro, who do we enslave? Two. Sometimes we enslave other Jews, and sometimes we enslave ourselves. We become both the master, the Paro, and the Eved, and the Jewish slave. That's the idea behind Shabbos. A person should work 6 days. But he needs 1 day. The 1 day is not that he doesn't work in that 1 day. Work is good for a person. But when you observe 1 day Shabbos, it's not just a different perspective of Shabbos. Shabbos gives a different perspective of your whole week. If you observe that Shabbos, you're not a slave. You're not a slave. But if you don't observe Shabbos, you become your own Paro. You become a slave. Avadai hey below avodim avodim. There's a contradiction. You can't be an Eved of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, servant of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. If you're a slave to somebody else, especially if you decide to be a slave to somebody else. And if you decide to be a slave to somebody else, you can be a slave, you can make yourself into your own slave. Shabbos reminds us that in the other 6 days of the week, we are free men. We work because we choose to work. We work because work is good for us. But we're not slaves of man, not of foreign men, not of other Jewish men, and not even slaves of ourselves. We are servants of God. And it's interesting, by an Eved, Ivri, 6 years. It's not the Shemitah cycle. 6 years from the day he starts working. He creates his own period, just like by Spirit Omer. We create our own weeks. We're Mona Yomim and we're Mona Shavuos. We count days and we count weeks. This to emphasize the idea that we're masters of time. As Rabbi Yehuda Halevi said, the Avdei Hazman Heim Avodim LaAvodim, Avdei Hashem Heim Rak Fnei Chorim. We demonstrate we are not slaves of time. We are masters of time. And in order, we have to understand. We have to understand David Ivri when he says, "I don't want to go free." He takes him to the door and he puts Evet Ozen Sheshama Har Sinai, the ear that heard at Mount Sinai, Avodai Haim, below Avodim LaAvodim. They are my servants, not the slaves of slaves. Yeratza, and he made himself into a slave. Yeratza. In other words, being a slave takes away from our serving HaKadosh Baruch Hu, from our serving God. And this is the idea of the connection to Shabbos. In other words, the idea is he goes out free on the seventh year. That he has to know that he's not a slave in the fullest sense of the word, an object that belongs to somebody else. He has to work for that person. He, in a sense, was bought for his work. Yes, there is difference in halachas. Certain things are even permitted to him. He has to do what his master tells him. But Mishakana Ebed Kana Adon Latzmo, one who acquires a Jewish servant, to a certain degree, he requires a master for himself. He has to be careful how he treats him. The seventh year, just like Shabbos, reminds us that we're not slaves. We're free people. That's why in Zeichel Yetzias Mitzrayim, we can't make ourselves into paros over ourselves. So the same thing is true about an Eved Ivri. He has to be reminded that he's not a slave, not a real slave, more of a servant than a slave. And he goes out free, and if he chooses to be a slave, Yeratza. Ozen Sheshama Sinai. Why? Because Har Sinai represents the completion of the freedom of the Jew from Egypt. The first of the Aseret Dibros. I took you out from the house of slavery, and I'm giving you your own culture, the culture of God. And it's only with the culture of God, when you have your own culture, that you will be truly free. Har Sinai represents the freedom of the Jew, the completion of the freedom of the Jew. And that's why, immediately connected with this idea of the perpetuation of the Sinai experience, the Torah tells us about Eved Ivri, because the Sinai experience represents the idea of the completion of the freedom of the Jew. And in a sense, it has to emphasize that this slave is really a free man. On the seventh year, he goes out free. It emphasizes it to us, it emphasizes it to the slave. We cannot enslave ourselves, we cannot be paros over ourselves, and we cannot be paro over other Jews either. We cannot make ourselves paro. Paro hu hayetzahara. Paro's the Yetzahara. And what's the idea? It's more than just that. But people who are enslaved, there is a psychological tendency to identify with your oppressor. And in a sense, when you identify with your oppressor, you sometimes imitate him in acting against Jews and sometimes against yourself. This is the problem with a paro, of making ourselves or letting ourselves become paro. When we treat other Jews as if they're lower than ourselves, if we're not concerned about their welfare, the way Paro was not concerned about his Jewish subjects, then we become Paro. I saw recently a letter by 100 cantors and rabbis and all that, critical of a position that takes action, that recognizes the reality that with all the attempts that the Jewish people made to live at peace, and every time they lived, they made attempts and they made sacrifices to live at peace with their neighbors, they were attacked. They were treated by some of the neighbors the way the Nazis treated the Jewish people. So rabbis, they put all kinds of names. Rabbi, and one wrote Erev Rav. You know, he's probably a rabbinical student, but he's more like the Erev Rav in the Midbar, or a she. I don't remember. It might have been a she rabbi. The Erev Rav, and then one wrote Kohanet, Kohen, Kohanet. They're not sure if they're male or they're female or whatever. All kinds. They take all kinds of names. Someone told me that that Kohen Kohanet organization is involved in a little bit some kind of a form of avodah zarah. I really don't know whether it's true or it's not true. I didn't research it. I have more important things to do. But whatever it is, it's, you know, there were people that brought avodah zarah with the Jewish people in the Midbar. And with the Nazis also, the Nazis had Jewish police who ruled over their kids, who ruled over the Jewish people. Okay, some of them were forced to do it. But here, these people, they're speaking up on behalf of the poor Palestinians who were cheering when they were dragging the bodies of the Jewish people, some half alive, on October 7th, in the parades that they mentioned. Don't think of this as October 7th. Think of this as World War II. Think of and the only way to stop Hitler, Yamach Shemo, would be to throw bombs on those who were enablers of Hitler, Yamach Shemo. Would they have marched in protest of the bombs that were thrown to bring an end to Hitler, to bring an end to the concentration camps, to bring an end to the gas chambers? There were a few rabbis that referred to the Jews of Europe in those days as the weeds of Judaism. But even they tried to hide it. They told it privately to President Roosevelt. But today, they sign a letter, and it's not any different than it would have been in World War II. These people would have marched with the Nazis. They They joined the Paros. They are part of the Paros that enslaved the Jewish people. The Abdei Paro who went along with him, who enslaved the Jewish people. Jewish people tried time and time again. And what those who were so much involved in peace, even they came to recognize. But those in the United States, they feel they're free. So they don't feel the pain of the mother. Oh, yes, they put a nice statement. We were opposed to what was done in October 7th. These people are enablers of the contemporary Nazis. The Jewish police during World War II, they were forced, okay, whether they should have done it or shouldn't have done it. But these people consider that being the aides of these Nazis is a moral obligation. We have to understand that when they do that, they become paros. They are enslaving most of the Jews in Israel today, even those that were the peace, that were advocating peace and peace and peace. Vein shalom, but there was never peace. They came to recognize their situation. But those that are comfortable here in the United States, so they can have the chutzpah to become the advocates for the Nazis, the contemporary Nazis. HaKadosh Baruch Hu should perhaps open their eyes, and they should see the lot of their brothers in Eretz Yisrael, and the V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. And understand that when you have an education system that brings up little children learning math, that when you have 5 Jews we have to kill, and our brave soldiers only kill 3, there are 2 left to kill. That's how they learn math. That these children are going to grow up to do the same thing that their parents did and their grandparents did. But these people are very comfortable here in the United States. So they can't feel the pain of the Jew. They can write a nice letter. But really, that nice letter is disgusting. It's similar to the private statements that some of their predecessors did during World War II. But I'll say that most of their predecessors were on a much higher level, or not as on a low level as these enablers of the contemporary Nazis. And we have to let people know that we are standing together with our brothers in Eretz Yisrael. It's not just enough to give a nice speech when it comes to Yisker. We have to act on their behalf. And we have to, Baruch Hashem, there is a government today in Eretz Yisrael that is enabling the Jewish people to defend themselves. Had we had this type of government beforehand, there probably would not have even had this present problem. There would have been problems, but it wouldn't have been to the degree that we have it right now. Okay.
Okay. Questions? To avoid being a paro over ourselves, what should we do? Should we focus on Ol Malchus Shemayim, or what should we do?
Obviously, Ol Malchus Shemayim, abad dahem below abad la'abad. One way to be free It's Avdei Hazman, Heim Avodim La'avodim. Avdei Hashem, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi says, Heim Rak B'nei Chorin. So by being servants of God, we are truly free. So that's one thing. And certainly, especially when it comes to a mitzvah of Shabbos, like Shabbos, being meticulous about Shabbos, the idea of not just refraining from doing work, but the idea to feel the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu on Shabbos. That is what gives us the freedom, in a sense that it's a little bit, Matan Torah was on Shabbos also. It's the idea of sensing HaKadosh Baruch Hu coming to us. HaKadosh Baruch Hu comes to us on Shabbos.
Yeah, what gives authority to Batei Dinim today that we listen to them?
Well, the Torah,
I mean, as opposed to the Beis Din Hagadol that we know are in the place of Moshe.
Okay. They don't have the authority of Beis Din Hagadol, but Beis Din has authority. You have a Supreme Court, and you have lower courts.
So the Batei Dinim today don't have the status. Obviously, don't have the status of but it's like a lower court.
Many halachas that the Batei Dinim today only have it by virtue of the fact that the earlier Batei Dinim enabled them, because we don't have real smuchim today. Okay, it's the Shaila in the Gemara, under what circumstances you need smuchim in theory, or you don't need smuchim. Yeah.
Rabbi used the term before, not really rabbis. So when not really rabbis go public on disagreeing with the Israeli policies, how far could we as an individual, let's say on social media, go to engage them in public?
What we have to say is, and this is what I think, that these people, because they didn't live in Israel, because they don't live in Israel, let me say, because they don't live in Israel, most of them, the overwhelming majority, don't live in Israel. They consequently do not sense the fear, and not suffering in a direct manner what the Jews in Israel are suffering, and because of that, they make these comments without really being aware of the suffering of the Jewish people in Israel. Similar to the attitude that many Jews in the United States had during World War II. I think it's important to put that
in. Okay, thank you. There aren't other questions here, so thank you, and thank everyone for attending, and everyone have a good week.
Okay.